She arrived as a virgin girl, but became the only hope that family had. Before we begin, comment your country so I know where this story is reaching. The day the train hissed and shrugged the dust of the east, she stepped down with 2 trunks and a pocket of silence. She was a virgin girl in the ledger of life, not because of what people assumed, but because the world had not yet taught her the old, rough lessons it kept for the taking. Her name was Elise Marlowe. She had learned to measure worth by the neatness of her stitches and the steadiness of her back. She had learned to keep promises to strangers because promises were the currency she could carry across plains. The station was smaller than the letter had promised. A board reading Ash Hollow swung on one hinge, salt and rust eating at the paint. The sky spread wide and empty. No man with strong hands or kindly eyes waited. Only a boy, barefoot, hair the color of winter wheat, watched her as if she had just stepped out of a storybook. He said nothing at first, only pointed toward the bluff. Then his voice, rusty from saying the word no one wanted to say, filled the empty platform. "He's gone," he told her, and the word was a stone dropped into a glass of water. It made ripples she could not ignore. She had been summoned by a letter, a dying man's scrawl asking that a woman come and be kind to his children. It read like a prayer and a request written on the same breath. Elise had packed hope into trunks. Simple things: a spool of thread, a tin of tea, a shawl, and the kind of courage that is not loud but practical. She had not come for a man. She had come because someone had asked and someone had been left behind. The house was not a house so much as a leaning story held together by equal parts grief and stubbornness. 6 children waited inside, faces hollowed by hunger and loss at odds with their small ages. A baby slept in a wooden crate beside the hearth. Its breath was a tiny metronome keeping time with the uncertain day. The eldest, Ezra, was 10 but wore responsibility, like a coat 2 sizes too large. Mercy, 8, moved as though she carried the whole world inside the curve of her small shoulders. The others were fragments, boys with quick feet and quieter spirits. She set down her trunks and set about the task the letter had implied, but never listed. There was no scene of soap and sunlight that the letter suggested, no neat life waiting. There was only cold and the practice of staying. She took the salted pork she had hidden from the conductor, drew water from the pump, and made a stew that tasted like more than food. She washed ragged sleeves until they softened, mended tears until they looked like proof. Each small action was a rope thrown into a life on the verge of fraying. The ledger she found under a loose floorboard later that night would tell her the rest. A man's hand had written her name in ink that quivered with hope. "If I die before she arrives," he had written, "let her keep the house. Let her raise them if she chooses." The words felt like a charge and a gift, and Elise folded them beneath her pillow as if to keep them warm until morning. She had not asked to be a mother. She had asked only to keep a promise. The promise took root. Days reshaped themselves into chores. She taught the children how to knead bread, so the flour would not cling to their fingers like shame. She taught Ezra how to balance the water bucket without spilling hope on the path. She coaxed Mercy into humming while she husked corn, so lullabies would return to the house like migrating birds. The rhythm of survival became the rhythm of belonging. One shovel, one stitch, one reprimand softened with a smile. Winter came with a thin cruelty. It pressed its face up to the windows and threatened to steal warm thread by thread. The men who had once eyed the Talmadge claim as debt and weakness returned in the form of boot prints and the paper of threats. They tested fences, prodded barn latches, and left messages in the shape of missing hens. Every warning was a small hurricane, every theft a new rung of fear. Still, she refused to answer threats with the hardness they expected. She answered with steadiness. She learned to collect neighbors like small habits, to barter bread for bolts of wool, to trade a night on the floor for a wedge of cured meat. A widow 3 miles down the road brought dried apples and sharp talk that smelled of reprieve. An old blacksmith lent his hammer and his quiet dignity. Gideon Talmadge, Silas's brother, came and left like a season's wind, sometimes distant, sometimes necessary, always an unspoken reminder of the past. He brought a key one rain-slick morning, and with a small safe under the floorboards, inside lay a deed, a letter, a pouch of worn buttons. Tokens of lives kept and remembered. One by one the children found their names in new ways. They began to call her mother. At first it was a test, a word thrown out like a pebble to see if she would flinch. Then Ezra said it with a kind of armor stripped away. Mercy whispered it, and the words settled between them like a small, honest fire. She never asked them to forget their grief. She asked only that they keep going, that they choose each other daily. Sickness came like a thief in the wind. Fever rattled to the cabin, taking small breaths and leaving only the shape of bravery. The baby stopped crying, and the night stretched in as a thread. She held him in a way she had not known she could hold. Close, pressing warmth into cold bones, singing hymns half-remembered and whispering promises she had not known she could keep. For days and nights she balanced on a wire of hope and exhaustion. When the fever broke and the children returned to life like plants surviving a late frost, the house exhaled, and the neighbors, who had watched from a cautious distance, came with bread and blankets and a kind of human relief. Threats persisted, though. Men with red-sealed papers rode in the thaw, claiming law that sounded civilized when they read it aloud and ferocious when they meant to take. They argued that land with no signed marriage was land without a lawful steward. She answered with a ledger, with Silas's note folded and read aloud beneath the lantern. "He trusted me," she said, and her voice did not tremble. Gideon stood at the fence with a shotgun in his hands, and neighbors gathered until the intruders left with curses and scuffed pride. Community had become a kind of armor she had not expected, one stitched with pies, hammers, books, and presents. Spring came grudgingly, and with it, the work of rebuilding hope. The garden patch near the old creek was coaxed awake, seeds tucked into the thawing soil by small, stubborn hands. Ezra dug until blisters painted his palms. Mercy turned compost into something softer and kinder. They planted more than beans that year. They planted trust. Gideon taught Ezra to swing a hammer. The boy's shoulders widened a fraction each day. Ione Harper arrived like a woman in pieces and stayed like a woman becoming whole. Her small baby found the rhythm of two cradles at once, and in time her hands learned kettle and needle, and she began to laugh in brief, tidal bursts. Community bound them. Mrs. Penhaligon's pies began to appear on the table, as if by ritual. The blacksmith's hammer kept the barn honest. The preacher sent books wrapped in twine. Even a fiddler wandered by once, and his music stitched a different kind of fabric into the nights. The house on Coyote Bluff stopped looking like a place people whispered about, and began to look like a place where you found a warm bed by asking. The law came again once, in the form of men with paper and a judge's seal, but this time they found a yard ringed with neighbors who would testify to the truth they had seen, a woman's hands, steady and honest. Children claimed and chosen, a ledger that held a dying man's last wish. Law is ink. Love is action, the sheriff said, and sometimes a pen understands a thing the heart has already proven. The men rode away, muttering and small. Seasons learned the cadence of the family. They learned that a child could be taught to mend a boot and to read a line out of a book. They learned that a woman who had stepped off a train expecting a bride could give herself to a dozen other small, obstinate people and turn a listless house into a home. And the world, which often rewards aloud and leaves a restaurant, sometimes looked away only to be surprised by the quiet manner in which lives were rebuilt. She never forgot she had come with a letter. She never forgot the strange currency of obligations asked by strangers. But what she hadn't expected was how claiming a family might change a person's name in their own mouth. Mother is a small word to some, an accident in biology. To her became a title earned at dusk and dawn, in the hands that mended, in the stew that doubled, and the quilt she stitched when fingers bled. It was baptism by daily routine, consecration by choosing again and again. There were no grand declarations of love or movie-style turning points. Only the slow accumulation of tasks met, nights watched, and tiny gestures that stitched them together. A repaired roof, a bellwether chicken safely housed, a baked loaf that wasn't scorched, a note tucked beneath a floorboard for a future stranger to find. Each small victory mattered as much as any battle ever could. Not every visitor left peace. Some rode with greed hidden under polite phrases. Some left warnings carved into fence posts. Once, men came with the sheriff's badge promised. The sheriff sat, read Silas's last wish, and looked beyond ink to the faces around the hearth. He left with concern written on his features and a caution in his step. Threats could return, he warned. But so could neighbors. Lawmen could be men, and men could be found on either side of the balance. She listened, and she prepared not to answer violence with violence, because it had never been in her nature, but to answer with unflinching stewardship and a community that chose to hold them. Summer widened the world. The garden yielded. A chicken coop sang in the morning, and the children ran with the kind of joy that can only grow from felt safety. Ezra carved toys from scrap wood. Mercy learned to stitch decorative edges on pillowcases. Ione taught the youngest boys to whistle. Gideon mended fences, and in small, quiet ways, taught the older boys the steadiness of work that is not about proving anything to anyone, but about doing the right task when nobody watched. Elise, once the virgin girl who had stepped down from the train, sat on the porch swing in late dusk with a baby in her lap, and thought how far the day's light had traveled since the train's whistle. She had been called by a letter and arrived with no vow of marriage. She had become the one who kept promises. No ring had bound her, only choices. To feed, to stitch, to stay. In the ledger she kept, she wrote simply, "If you find this house, know that love here is voluntary and fierce. Come in if you need shelter. Leave your burdens at the door, and we will add a blanket." The story of this first chapter was not one of romance stitched to a neat ending. It was woven from the messy fibers of hardship and small mercies, from the quiet courage of a woman who would be called mother by a handful of ragged, bright children. It was a proof written in the language of work and kindness that families could be chosen, that a home could be built not from titles, but from stubborn love. Spring settled slowly over Ash Hollow, not with gentleness, but with the stubborn push of a land determined to wake again. The snow melted into deep grooves along the slope, and the earth breathed for the first time in months. Elise stepped outside one morning and felt the damp soil under her boots, rich and dark, as if the world was finally willing to let something grow again. Inside the cabin, life had begun to take shape. The children no longer moved like shadows. They had found rhythm in the work she guided them through. Ezra carried water with steadier hands. Mercy learned to shape dough without tearing it. Jonas and Levi chased chickens every morning, their laughter rising like a bright streak through the cold air. Even the baby slept better, tucked against Elisa's heartbeat as she worked. Each day she discovered more of what the land required. She walked the boundary of the property, counting fence posts, prying loose boards, and studying the bare patch of earth behind a barn where a garden had once fought to survive. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the dirt. It was dry near the surface, but deeper down she felt life waiting. She knew that feeling well, something buried, but capable of rising again if someone cared enough to coax it awake. Ezra watched her with a seriousness beyond his years. "Pa tried to make things grow," he said quietly. "Then we'll try again," Elise replied. "And this time we'll do it together." They worked side by side, turning the earth until their hands blistered. Mercy fetched buckets of creek water. The younger boys carried stones to mark the rows. Ione stood in the doorway with the baby on her hip, humming as she watched life unfold where winter had tried to take root. The garden became their first act of hope. Neighbors began to visit more often now that the worst storms had passed. Mrs. Penhaligon trudged up the path with a sack of dried apples and a tone sharp enough to slice through grief. Old Otis brought hinges, nails, and the kind of silence that felt like expertise rather than distance. The preacher sent a bundle of books tied in twine. People who once saw only a stranger in Elise now saw a household rising from the edge of ruin. She mended clothes until her fingers ached. She patched the roof with tar cloth and prayer. She scrubbed the walls until the scent of old grief faded enough that the cabin felt like a place where breath could settle. She found time to teach Ione to sew. The young girl's hands trembled at first, but by the second week she stitched neat lines into torn shirts. Her face softened, the frightened edges beginning to smooth into something almost peaceful. The baby grew stronger, cheeks rounding, breath steady. Elise often caught Ione smiling when she thought no one watched. One warm afternoon, Elise pulled the safe from under the floorboards again. She read Silas's final words in the quiet of the cabin while the children napped. The letter carried the weight of a man's last breath, asking her to stay, asking her to care for children he feared would be left without a shield. She folded the paper with new reverence and tucked it into the ledger. The promise she had made the day she stepped off the train was no longer a choice she reconsidered. It had become part of her spine. But peaceful days never lasted long in Ash Hollow. Late in the season, two riders came up the path again, Brackett and Miller, the same men whose boot prints had first disturbed the barn. This time, they carried a document sealed in red wax. Their horses pawed the ground as if impatient to bring trouble. Ezra stepped in front of her instinctively, chest rising in quick breaths. Mercy stood behind him, clutching the baby. Elise moved forward, her hand steady. The men claimed the land belonged to the county now. No legal marriage meant no legal mother. No claim, no rights. Nothing but ink and authority that did not care about hunger or hope. Elise did not raise her voice. She lifted the ledger, opened to Silas's final entry, and read his words aloud so the men would hear the truth from the dead himself. She showed them the deed, the safe key, the list of harvests, the note naming her as the one he trusted to hold this family. But words were not always enough. Then Gideon stepped from behind the barn, the worn shotgun resting along his arm. His presence changed the shape of the moment. Brackett's arrogance flickered. Miller's smirk dimmed. They backed down eventually, but not because the law had changed its mind. They backed down because Elise was no longer standing alone. The men left with thin threats twisting through the dust behind their horses. But Elise knew they would return. Trouble had a way of finding families who dared to build something out of scraps. That night she sat at the table long after the children slept, writing new entries into the ledger, not out of duty to Silas, but because the book had become a witness, a guardian of their days. She wrote of Mercy's bread that didn't crumble, of Ezra's strength, of the garden rose ready for planting. She wrote because truth needed a place to live that fear could not erase. The next week brought the first true warmth of the year. They planted tomatoes, beans, squash. Water soaked into the earth as though the land had been waiting for their hands. Every child worked until their cheeks glowed. Even the baby babbled happily from a quilt spread on the grass. The cabin changed, too. Elise stitched new curtains from flour sacks. The children swept the floors until the wooden planks glowed. Ione hung herbs to dry. The smell of sage and rosemary drifted through the rooms like a blessing. The house was becoming theirs. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the bluff, Gideon came again. He didn't speak much. He repaired a shutter, oiled the hinges, and checked the fence line. When he finally stood on the porch beside Elise, he glanced toward the children chasing each other in the yard. "My brother knew what he was doing," he said quietly. Elise didn't answer. She didn't need to. The children grew stronger with the season. Ezra took pride in chores. Mercy learned to read from the preacher's books. Jonas and Levi stopped flinching at sudden sounds. The baby began to sleep through the night. Each small victory stitched another thread into the home they were weaving. And then came the afternoon when Elise realized the house was no longer simply shelter. It had become a root in the ground, a declaration against the loneliness of the plains. She had been a stranger when she stepped off that train, a virgin girl with 2 trunks, a thin shawl, and a stubborn belief that kindness was worth carrying cross-country. Now she was a keeper of family, the anchor of a life, the woman who chose to stay when the world gave her every excuse to leave. This was not the ending of her story. It was the middle, the part where resolve grows thicker than fear, where love begins to look less like luck and more like labor, where a home chooses its keeper as surely as the keeper chooses the home. And in Ash Hollow, under a sky as wide as the future, Elise Marlowe knew one thing with a certainty that steadied her breath. She was not leaving. Not now. Not ever. Summer swept over Ash Hollow with a quiet kind of heat. The earth warmed enough that seeds pushed to the garden soil, small green blades stretching toward sky that finally softened. Elise spent her mornings kneeling between the rows, guiding tiny hands as they watered the first sprouts. She felt something rise inside her each time a new leaf broke open. Life did not need permission. It only needed a chance. The house had changed, too. It no longer carried the scent of hunger or cold fear. It smelled of bread cooling on the windowsill, of herbs hanging from the rafters, of sun-warmed cotton and clean air. Mercy learned to mix spices into stew until even the neighbors commented on the fragrance drifting across the yard. Ezra checked the barn every morning, his shoulders straight, his stride steady. Jonas, Levi, and Thomas chased each other barefoot through the field with shouts bright as sunlight. Even Ione stood taller now. Her baby was robust and pink-cheeked, and she had carved out a place in the home without asking permission. She stitched blankets with Elise at night, telling small pieces of her story only when ready. She no longer trembled when someone knocked. She no longer flinched when a stranger rode by on the ridge. Healing came slowly, but it came. But with the thawed earth came troubled riders. For weeks, Elise sensed movement around the bluff. She saw dust where no cattle grazed. She saw shapes by the ridge at dusk, too still to be deer, too distant to be friendly. She said nothing at first, not one to plant fear where hope had only begun to grow. But one evening, while the children washed up after supper, Elise stepped outside and found boot prints near the side of the cabin. Deep impressions. A man had stood there long enough to watch through the window. She called Ezra and showed him the tracks. His expression sharpened. "They're coming back," he whispered. She didn't tell the others. That night she bolted the door twice, checked the windows, and sat awake in a rocking chair with the baby sleeping against her chest. She waited until dawn, listening to the wind slip through the grass, listening for any sound that didn't belong. The house rested, but she could not. The next morning Gideon rode in early. He studied the boot prints, jaw tight. "They're testing you," he said. "They want you scared before they return. Then they'll be disappointed," Elise replied. Together they reinforced the barn door, lined the porch posts with sturdy timber, and walked the property edge. Gideon showed Ezra how to read ground signs, how to see the difference between harmless visitors and men with intention. Elise watched them from a distance, filled with a quiet gratitude she didn't try to name. By midsummer, the children swarmed with energy the land could barely hold. They ran with bright laughter that spilled across the cabin walls. They gathered wildflowers for Elise's table, leaving petals scattered across the porch steps. They brought her beetles, feathers, wild fruits, and once a baby hare with trembling whiskers. Life kept giving them small, unexpected gifts. One warm afternoon, Elise carried laundry to the riverbank. She knelt in the water, scrubbing shirts against a smooth stone, the sunlight warming her shoulders. The breeze tugged her loose blouse, brushing her skin as if reminding her she was still young, still capable of joy, even after all the things she carried. As she wrung out a shirt, Ezra ran toward her breathless. "Riders," he said. "4 of them." She straightened. "Are they heading here?" He nodded. They hurried back to the cabin. Gideon was already mounting his horse, eyes fixed on the ridge. "Stay inside," he told her. "Lock the door." But Elise shook her head. "No, I won't hide in my own yard." Gideon studied her for a long moment. Something unspoken passed between them. Respect, determination, the shared knowledge that a home must be defended by the ones who claim it. He dismounted and took his place beside her. The riders approached slowly, dust rising around their horses. Brackett led them, smug and ready for a fight. He thought he'd already won. Miller held the reins tight. 2 new men flanked them, both with the look of men who didn't bother with honesty. When they stopped at the porch, Brackett unfolded a new paper with a fresh seal. "Judge signed it yesterday," he announced. "Says these children aren't yours. Says the land isn't yours. Says you leave by sundown." Ezra stepped in front of her before she could answer. "You can't take us." Brackett ignored him. "The law says we can." Elise lifted her chin. "And we say otherwise." Miller laughed and nodded at the men beside him. "Take the boys first." But before they could move, neighbors stepped from behind the trees and from beyond the path. Mrs. Penhaligon with her rolling pin, Otis with his hammer, a ranch hand with rope coiled at his side. More faces appeared, men and women who had tired of watching good people be threatened by greed. Gideon walked down the steps slowly. "For riders," he said, "do you see how many stand behind this house?" The men hesitated. Fear cracked through their bravado. Brackett's expression turned sour. "This isn't over." "It is today," Elise replied. They left with hard stares and angry dust, riding away faster than they'd come. Elise stood still long after they disappeared over the ridge. Relief trembled in her bones, but she did not show it. The children clung to her. The neighbors gathered around her, offering food, blankets, tools, gifts that meant more than supplies, gifts that meant she was no longer a stranger among them. The garden flourished that month, as if the earth itself approved. Tomatoes ripened, beans curled around their posts. The children harvested in little baskets, laughing as they carried them inside. Elise watched them with a full, settling warmth. She realized the house didn't simply survive because she stayed. It survived because they all stayed. Each child, each neighbor, each helping hand, each stubborn heartbeat. Late in the season, Elise added a final entry to the ledger. A house becomes a home when enough people decide it will not fall. Years later, she would remember the moment she wrote that line, how the ink settled deeply into the paper, how the children sat at her feet listening, how Gideon leaned quietly against the doorframe, watching them with an expression that held something steady, something almost tender. The house on Coyote Bluff never fell. It grew. It welcomed strays, travelers, widows, runaways, and lonely souls who needed a warm place to rest. Elise became known as the woman who never turned anyone away. The children grew into men and women who remember hunger and answered it with generosity. Neighbors brought new families to her door, saying, "If you need a place to begin again, this is where beginnings live." Elise often sat on the porch during those later years, watching young families build new cabins on the land, listening to children laugh, feeling the slow beat of a life she had once nearly walked away from. She had come west as a virgin girl, with little more than a shawl and a promise to keep. But she stayed as the hope that held a family together. She stayed as the heart of a home that refused to break. She stayed because the children needed her. And in time, she needed them just as much. And that is how a stranger became the only light a forgotten family had, by choosing them before she knew them, and loving them long after she could have walked away. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and comment your country so I know where this Wild West family is reaching.